So, just to make sure, this is the panel discussion on financing the accessory dwelling unit, and we should have added and why that is so very, very hard. But hopefully we'll give you some ideas at least. Okay. The housekeeping note the organizers asked me to forward to you. If you are interested in GBCI or AIA credit, please sign the sheet. I believe that's up here. And write legibly, they say. My name is Martin John Brown. I am a freelance researcher, and one of the subjects I work on is environment and housing. And I'm the co-author of a journal article that's coming out in an appraisal journal in a month or so about understanding and appraising properties with accessory dwelling units. Taylor Watkins here was my co-author on that study. And besides trying to give sort of an authoritative summary of what ADUs really are and issues around them, we created a valuation method for properties with ADUs based on income. So hopefully that'll be some interesting reading. If you want to know more about me personally, you can go to my website, martinjohnbrown.net. What we're going to talk about today is, first I'm going to give you a background on some basic things that you might not know about ADUs that probably will have some impact on your ability to finance or refinance properties with them. Then Cole Peterson is going to talk about sort of more concrete things about ADU projects from a sort of grassroots homeowner enthusiast perspective. Cole is a really good, passionate sort of advocate for ADUs. He extensively documented the construction of his own ADU and very, to his credit, put all the prices on there, provided a lot of details that you don't normally see in sort of design publications. So I'm glad to have him here. Then Dakota Gale from Green Mortgage Northwest will talk about how to finance new ADU projects or refinance properties that have ADUs from his perspective as a person in the lending industry. And I think hopefully he will give us some clues about what to do, even though this is a difficult thing to accomplish. And finally, because appraisals are going to be a central part of any attempt at financing, Taylor Watkins of Watkins and Associates will give us his perspective on how appraisals work and how the people involved in the process can try to make the results more accurate. So ADUs are a really simple, intuitive idea, I think. We see this picture where there's clearly some sort of a dwelling up in this attic and egress has been provided. You can automatically, you can almost tell that there's a student or someone living up there. They're probably paying rent to the owners of the main house. They're contributing somehow to this sort of mini community. I like this picture because it sort of represents, the mountainous challenge of actually getting this around. Or to give another example, you can also see that the natural appeal of an ADU in this picture of a backyard cottage. Here's the main house. Backyard cottage is recessed, and if there wasn't like a party going on, you could see a grandparent or someone living there, or maybe a caretaker for an older person who lives in the main house. So it's a really natural idea. But paradoxically, these projects are really hard to finance, even though you can see from the pictures they probably produce some sort of rent which should support a case for financing. So the panelists here are going to give you some of the more involved bureaucratic reasons why financing is difficult. But before they do that, I need to give you some really basic information that's behind everything. And that is, people are confused. They're confused about what ADUs are and what they can do. And I'm not just talking about homeowners. There are a lot of professionals from all over the lending and building industries who aren't exactly sure what ADUs are and how they can function legally. So please track with me as I go through some of this stuff to make sure that we're all on the same page. So an accessory dwelling unit is a small self-contained dwelling that shares the site of a larger single unit home. So it's the relationship of the two dwellings, not the architectural form. Could be either attached, like the attic apartment, or detached, like the backyard cottage. There are a lot of synonyms for accessory dwelling unit. And I'm going to name them all, even though it's tiresome, because all of these words and phrases have been used as exact synonyms for accessory dwelling unit. Accessory apartment, accessory unit, ancillary unit, backyard cottage, carriage house, casita, garden suite, granny cottage, granny flat, granny unit, in-law, in-law unit, mother-in-law flat, laneway house, secondary unit, SDU, and sidekick. And they usually mean the same thing functionally, except when they don't. There are people in the industry who make distinctions between these different synonyms, and there are other people who don't really make any distinctions. But some of the government-sponsored entities who purchase or guarantee mortgages do make distinctions based on these terms. So especially between secondary unit and accessory dwelling unit. That detail will be in our paper. Whatever you call them, ADUs are often in single-family residential neighborhoods, and they're often legally rentable. They're never, in this view, separate properties. That is, they have the same owner as the primary dwelling. Unfortunately, on an institutional basis, that creates a contradiction. To us, intuitively, when we see the backyard cottage, we say, oh, that's where somebody's grandma lives. We get it. It doesn't seem out of place in a single-family neighborhood. But on an institutional basis, a house with an ADU looks like an income-producing two-unit property in a single-family residential neighborhood. And, as I think these guys will talk about, there's not really a category for that. Moreover, there are a lot of illegal ADUs out there, and they really muddy the picture. There's some great sort of documentary expose shots of life in illegal ADUs. I like this kitchen with the air conditioner and the hot plate on top of the microwave. And I like the more sort of romantic bohemian appeal of this place. They easily could be places where your children are living. Illegal. There are tens of thousands, possibly even hundreds of thousands of illegal ADUs in the country. They're really common in crowded urban areas like San Francisco or Boston. And there is a fair number around Portland, maybe 2 or 3 times the number of legal ones. They tend to dominate perceptions of ADUs. So a real estate agent, for example, might see an ADU in a house and assume it's illegal, downplay it in the listing, and then somehow make the owner believe that it's illegal, even when it's permitted. Government-sponsored enterprises like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are more accustomed to illegal ADUs than legal ones. So they have a lot of guidelines written for how to deal with the illegal ones, but very little for how to deal with illegal ones. And I hypothesize that that sort of taints legitimate ADUs and ends up encouraging people to give them little value, even when they're generating lots of income. So we can only talk about legal ADUs. I think that's what we're going to do, because they're more comparable to each other. If you have a legal ADU, you can often rent it out. This is a key part of their functional worth. In many cities, the owner has to occupy one unit, but they can rent out the other unit. In Portland, both units can be rented out. Hopefully, that income could influence a case for financing, but I'm not sure that's really the case, and maybe our speakers will illuminate that a little. So now you know the basics. But the question you need to ask when you're dealing with a property that has an ADU or could have an ADU is, do all your colleagues know the same things? For ADUs to be properly valued and then properly financed, everyone in the transaction has to be aware of their legal uses. You shouldn't assume that even the homeowner knows what's going on. You can refer people to the article we have coming out in the Appraisal Journal for sort of a authoritative, hopefully, introduction to the subject. And if we get everybody on the same sort of basis of knowledge, I'm hoping that in the future we can have less people living in conditions like this and more people living in places like this. That is a cottage by Walt Quaid in Portland. So now Cole Peterson will give us the advocate's perspective. Does anybody want to ask a question? Go ahead.
How do you assess how many illegal ADUs there are?
I don't want to get too bogged down in this, but I can give you a reference afterwards.
Okay.
All right, one more.
Are you specifically talking about Portland, or are you talking about national? Because the zoning for ADUs are different for different cities.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So what are you talking about today?
Well, we have the most experience in Portland, but I've asked the panelists to, at least expand a little bit beyond Portland to Oregon, and hopefully make it more general. But obviously, we can't be an expert on every single municipality.
Okay. I'm guessing there's a good handful of people from Washington.
Uh-huh. Cool.
All right, well, great kind of primer on some of the kind of definitions of ADUs. Thanks. So my name is Cole Peterson. I own an ADU and live in one in Northeast Portland. And this is the blog that I have for that ADU. Kind of documents every part of the process. I consider myself an ADU advocate because I think they're great for so many reasons. I'm sure everybody in this room kind of thinks they're great for their own reasons. And they're probably interested in maybe building one themselves because they're so awesome. And so part of what I'm going to talk about is like the financial case for why they're so incredible, but also allude to some of these difficulties related to financing them. So I teach a class out of my ADU, 13 people, $95 a class. If you want to build an ADU, I recommend coming to the class because it just covers a lot of the information that you would need to get up to speed on all the different processes related to building one. All right, so I also co-edit this site with Martin and another Eli Spivak, who's here today. And this is a blog that kind of is intended to serve as a one-stop shop for ADUs. Jordan alluded to it earlier. So I recommend that site. I'm going there first. And there's my contact info, colepeterson@gmail.com. So homeowner economics of ADUs. I'm not a professional financier or appraiser. I'm really not a professional in any of the fields that I'm going to allude to today. There isn't. I'm the best you're going to get. So you have to deal with it. All right. So I'm going to cover cost of building an ADU, payback periods for ADUs, and commonly used tools for financing an ADU. And these are kind of expounding upon some of the ideas that I cover in my class. So in addition to ADUs, I'm also just going to allude to other space-efficient alternative housing costs because they're relevant just to see how much ADUs cost compared to other housing forms. So the cost of building an ADU. So detached ADUs, garage conversions, and new construction will cost are expensive. Garage conversions are going to end up costing about the same amount as new construction detached ADUs, depending on the foundation and the structure, depending on what state they're in. If it's an old garage with a poor foundation and the structure's kind of falling apart, you're going to end up spending maybe even a little bit more than a new construction ADU might cost. Whereas if it's a very new garage and it's in really good shape and it was built to the same standards that the city would require for it to be a habitable dwelling, you might save some money. But generally speaking, for garage conversions and new construction ADUs, it's expensive. Attached ADUs, such as bump outs, carve outs, basement attic conversions are much less expensive. However, I will not be addressing that primarily today. But just know that everything I'm saying is applicable for detached construction, but if you're going to do attached, that's a different ballgame, and I can't even begin to estimate how much that might cost, but it's significantly less, maybe half or whatever, but there's a lot of variables there. Okay, so for detached ADUs, there's fixed costs and variable costs. Fixed costs are things like, generally speaking, you're going to need a kitchen, you're going to need a bathroom, you're going to need an electrical connection, regardless of whether you're living in a 400 square foot house or a 3,000 square foot house. And those costs are going to be more or less the same for these huge McMansions or for an ADU. So those are fixed costs generally. And then there's things like variable costs, like your framing, roofing, insulation, permit fees, and painting might vary with the size of your structure. But you can get a sense that by, based on that premise, the smaller your house, the more it's going to cost per square foot. Does that make sense? Okay, so the design build costs for basic custom new construction ADUs around Portland generally ranges from 100 to 175 per square foot for a fully livable detached dwelling unit. That's generally what I hear. I think if you were to build a McMansion and you were a McMansion developer out in the suburbs, you might get a cost of construction for about $80 per square foot. That's for tract construction, very cheap. So you're not going to get it at that price. And what I'm talking about is if you're hiring somebody else to do the entire job from start to finish. This is kind of the median cost. It could get a little bit cheaper if you were to use some tricks, using used materials or doing the work partially yourself or whatever. But and it could be more expensive than this. It could get up to $300 a square foot depending on what contractors you choose. But this is the general ballpark that I'm going to put out there as, average ADU cost per square foot. 800 square foot custom ADU. Therefore, you count on spending $80,000 to $140,000. And this is if you're hiring out the entire job to somebody else. So that's expensive. Smaller structures are going to cost even more per square foot due to the fixed costs, such as the bathroom, the kitchen, the electrical. And so therefore, you should count on spending more like $125 to $200 a square foot. So we're talking $50,000 to $80,000 for a 400 square foot ADU. That making sense to everybody? All right, so that's an extremely intimidating figure for almost everybody who wants to build an ADU. I don't have $100,000 to spare. How am I going to do this? So I like to walk it back and say, okay, just so you know, there are alternatives. There's no way you can get that much money. I'm just going to rattle off some less expensive alternatives. So tiny houses, which there's a session about today. I'm sure everybody's heard of tiny houses. Those might cost anywhere from $20,000 for a kit to $40,000 to purchase one made for you. Prefab ADUs. Walt Quaid, who Martin alluded to, smallhomesoregon.net, he will build the cheapest ADU that I'm familiar with in the city of Portland for you for $45,000. So that's pretty amazing. It's way less than the figure I quoted earlier. But it's pretty simple and it's pretty small. So that's not going to work for a lot of people. You know, you can probably add bells and whistles to it, but that's the base price, and that's pretty awesome that that's out there as an option for people. But if you're just looking to expand the space of your property for say, a place for people to sleep, but they don't need a bathroom or a kitchen, you can do this for much less than an ADU. You could potentially build a space like that for $5,000 or $20,000. And structures that are under 200 square feet don't even require permits, except for the building services such as electrical, plumbing, and heat. So this is a picture of tiny house, $20,000 to $40,000. Waltquaid's, ADU, $40,000 if it's an ADU, and $9,000 if it's just a detached bedroom. This is just another detached bedroom, like natural building construction. And then we have the yurt, which could kind of provide some of the same function that you might want out of an ADU, except it's basically just a bedroom. But that's only $3,000. So, if $80,000 to $100,000 seems way too much and you can't handle that, you can consider something like a yurt if that would meet your needs. So I like to walk that back to say, if an ADU isn't feasible for you for whatever reason, these are other options to at least consider. But walking it back a little bit more, I want to talk about the payback periods for the costs of the construction, because that's one of the more compelling aspects of ADUs. For my story is that I was looking for a financially sustainable form of housing to live in, and I just generally felt like I didn't want to be putting 50% of my income or 25% of my income into my housing, whether that was my mortgage or my rent. But I wanted to live in a space that I liked. So what could I do? I explored a lot of different options and kind of learned about ADUs at that point as a viable mechanism to achieve that kind of benchmark. I want to have housing that pays for itself. How do I do that? So I'm going to throw out here a really simple method for calculating payback periods for ADUs, which I'm just going to use for this session, whether or not it's not like an authoritative way standard, but it's just kind of what I'm going to use to explain how amazing these ADUs are in terms of their ability to generate income. So in that method is, how long will it take to pay for the cost of ADU construction by the property's rental income? And the caveat here is that I'm comparing various ADUs, so I'm excluding variables that differ a lot from ADU to ADU, such as the mortgage, the taxes on the property, the bills, the utilities, or loans that were used for cost of construction of the ADU. I'm just talking about the rental income, how long that would take for you to pay back the cost of construction. So, for example, if you lived in the house and rent out the ADU, it will take X number of years of rental income from the ADU to pay for the ADU construction. And conversely, if you live in the ADU and rent out the house, it will take X number of years of rental income from the main house to pay for the cost of the ADU construction. So the reality, though, is that the payback periods are really messy. So this is a real life set of scenarios I'm going to provide. I'm going to start off with kind of a multi-generational family model living on a house in ADU to show you the messiness involved. So, real life story here from Portland. Grandma wanted to live near her grandkids, so she funded the construction of a 200 square foot ADU. It cost $25,000 for the materials and the permits. And the son who owned the property with his wife designed and built the ADU for her. So there was all the soft costs of actually doing the design work in the building weren't a factor because she didn't have to pay for that.
Labor
So
is a hard cost. Labor is considered a hard cost when he built it for her. That's
Okay.
a hard cost.
Okay,
Just-
good. Well, I should say material costs. $25,000 for the material costs and permit costs. So for $25,000, the grandma now has a place to live, rent and mortgage free, and she's living close to her children and grandchildren for as long as she wants. So it's a good deal for her. The parents who own the property have gained equity on the property, let's say approximately $40,000. I'm just making that up. And in turn, they've invested in-kind cost, sweat equity into the project. But let's also consider some of the other kind of less tangible or tangible but difficult to calculate payback, financial paybacks to this arrangement. So, babysitting, they're getting, the kids are getting babysitting for their grandkids. Car sharing, they have one less car than they would otherwise need for this house. Meal sharing, they're sharing meals. They're sharing chores. They're able to care for the property of the other person when you're away. So instead of paying somebody to look after your dog, they have their mom to do that, or their grandma. And less commuting for family social events. And the biggest benefit is that you don't have to share a roof with your mother or mother-in-law. And I love that picture right there. Mother-in-law for sale by So that sums it up right there. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few more. That's kind of a messy scenario that gives you the reality of how confusing this subject is. But we're going to go back to this kind of simple method of evaluating the payback periods for ADUs. So this is a story that was in the Daily Journal of Construction, Oregon, DJC, recently. And I'll just mention it because it's in this article. One of the options out there for people, homeowners who want to do ADU construction on a house that they just bought is called Advantis Credit Union's Rehab Mortgage. And this article alludes to this particular mortgage program. And it's important to write that down if you're interested, because it's probably one of the only programs out there that you can get access to right now if you're in Portland. And that's a fixer upper loan program, but it's more flexible than most programs like it. So
Could you name that again, please?
it's called the Advantis Credit Union's Rehab Mortgage. ADUs are allowed and buyers can borrow up to 90% of a home's after improved appraised value. So this is documentation of this actually having been done. I know the guy who did this, so it's really happened, and that's awesome. So as long as there's a pathway, it's amazing for people who want to do this. It might be the only pathway, but as long as there's one, that's the pathway. So in this case, $82,000 went towards the cost of construction for the ADU, and the rental income that he gets off of the main house is about 85% of his total mortgage payment, which includes financing for the ADU. So this is a guy who bought a property and is built the ADU, lives in the ADU now, and rents out that property and gets 85% of his mortgage covered, mortgage including the cost of ADU construction, covered by the rental income off the main house. And so in this case, this is just get familiar with this kind of box here, because we're going to see this for the next 4 slides. $82,000, $1,700 a month renting out the house, 4.1 years payback period. It's an incredible payback period. Okay, second example. This is from the Portland Tribune, not too long ago, maybe 2 weeks ago. Sue Firpo, who was on the Build It Green tour, she's not here, is she? I don't know who she is. Okay. So she spent $95,000 out of pocket for her 500 square foot ADU, which is about what per square foot? 195, 200. So that's in that ballpark that we talked about earlier. So she listed it for rent at about $1,075 per a month before the Build a Green tour, and several prospective renters stopped by during the tour. I guarantee you that she's had no problem renting out this place because, like you saw in Jordan's keynote, there's this huge demand for these small detached units, and we'll talk about that more in a second. So in this case, we have that same graph: $95,000 for construction, $1,075 a month income. 7.4 year payback period. Still really good payback period. Anything less than 10 years, most I guess kind of the standard business thinking is 10-year payback period is a good investment. So this is an ad. I don't know how much the cost of this construction costs, but this is an ad for an ADU in Southeast, somewhere off Ladd's Addition, $19.50 a month. Okay. So just a better location maybe. And this was no longer available. I contacted it. It was no longer available for rent. So I'm assuming that it rents for $19.50, maybe it's a little bit less. I don't know. But this is a fully furnished, brand new 1-bedroom alley ADU somewhere in Ladd's Addition or nearby there. So if this cost $100,000, just making that up, She's renting at $950. That's a 4.25 year payback period. Okay, so I used Joe's 6-pack instead of, I don't know, I just can't, that's, yeah. So this is Joe, this is a hypothetical Joe, right? So we'll go through 3 scenarios here. 800 square foot ADUs cost $100,000, and Joe is living in the house and renting out the ADU for $1,000 a month. He's making $12K a year off of it, and that's an 8.3 year payback period. He's built an 800 square foot ADU, spent $100,000, and he's renting out the house for $2,000 a month, which is a fair, average rental income on a 3-bedroom house, 4-bedroom house in Portland. He's making $24,000 a year, and that's about a 4.2 year payback period. Third example is he's renting out the house and the ADU, which you can do in Portland. And so let's say that's $1,000 plus $2,000, that's $36,000 a year. That's a 2.7 year payback period. And these are I would go as far as to say these are conservative estimates from my experience, because my experience is that I spend $100,000 for my ADU, and I'm renting out the house for $3,000 a month, and that's a 2.7 year payback period. And this is my life, so I know that this is true. This is the ADU. Here's the main house. Nothing special about it. It's a nice, 4-bedroom house. Good location. Nothing special about it, and amazing ADU. I love living in it. And so it's achieving. It's not only am I living for free. It's not just making my rental, my mortgage payments for me, but it's generating income every month. The operating expenses for ADUs. The mortgages and loans may vary a lot, obviously. The ADU bills will be very low. These are my bills somewhere between $18 and $50 a month for my heating and cooling and cooking gas bills, so that's really cheap. But the property tax increases may be very high. I just got this letter this week that's showing my property taxes are supposed to go up from $1,600 to $4,000 a month. I'm actively appealing this, but I put this out there only as to say that there's a chance that your taxes may go up a lot if you have a permanent ADU and they somehow deem that its value is greater than it really should be. So anyway, this is probably the worst case scenario because this is not going to stand if I have anything to say for it. But it's it could theoretically go up a lot, your taxes. If I have a blog post about this, and if I'm able to successfully appeal this, then I'll post that as well, so that people can see what my taxes really ended up being. But yeah, that's a good figure to know about. I think the others might have some anecdotes to share about that as well.
Just to play devil's advocate, aren't you claiming how much value you're adding to your property, and then you're arguing about paying increased taxes on that value?
That's what I'm supposed to do, though.
No,
I think I think the answer is I want it to be fairly appraised at its. There's 2 sides of me. I was just talking about this before the session. Part of me wants to have it appraised at a lot of value so that I can get a good loan for it. I refinanced and I wanted it to be worth $1 million so that I could easily get the loan that I want, refi it and get a good loan for it. And the other side of me says, Connie, this isn't worth very much because I don't want to pay a lot of taxes for it. But I think the answer is you want it to be appraised at a fair market value. So it cost me $100,000 and it should add about $100,000 to the value of the property. Instead, they're saying it added $150,000 value to the property. So I'm contesting that, and I have good evidence to support my case, and I think I can get it knocked down to that. So.
You should say why.
What's that?
He should say why it was assessed at 1,350 square feet versus 100.
Right.
So they're saying it's almost double the size it really is.
Yeah, the assessor just didn't he walked in and somehow did the calculations to come up with the figure that it was 1,350 square feet when in fact it's can't be, it's $7.99. So that's probably, they probably just did a per square foot cost.
Great design.
Yeah. Yeah. So it looks bigger than 800 square feet, but it definitely doesn't look like a 1,300 square foot home. All right, so I talked about, you know, the payback period being 2.7 years in my case for my property based on that kind of standard that I was using before. But in reality, and I only know this for myself, but the reality is I want to spell this out a little bit more. So the house mortgage is $1,700 a month, so that's an expense I incur every month. After mortgage, rental expenses for the main house, taxes and bills, the property will be grossing $1,300 a month, or $15,000 a year. So I'm earning $15,000 a year. And so the payback period, even with all those variables in mind, is still 6.4 years after all of my expenses. That's an amazing payback period. Okay? So I think that even with all these, you know, potential high costs and all these other, you know, real life expenses, the payback period easily justifies building for anyone building one of these if they can afford to do it. If there's no other reason you're building it other than just for the money, it makes a lot of sense. So, jumping the capital hurdle, ADU financing options. So this is what I cover in the class because people are like, okay, I'm sold, I came to the class, I want to build one, but I don't have $100,000. So how do you do it? So the most common way that people do it are to use liquid assets, namely retirement savings or other, you know, savings that they have, and that's probably the most common way to do it. The second most common way to do it is through family loans. So since banks aren't in a position right now to, or don't understand how to finance, how to give loans for these programs, what most people are doing, that I've found, is getting low interest loans from family members, their parents, or their aunt and uncle who have the capital and are only making 1 or 2% in conservative money market accounts, and they want to help out their niece or nephew or son or daughter or granddaughter, and so they give a low interest loan to them. They're getting more than what they would get in the bank, so it's good for them. They're helping out their family. Again, that's good for them. And the kid is getting a loan that they couldn't get from the bank anywhere. So it's great. It's a great win-win situation. So that's really, in reality, that's what people are really doing right now, family loans. I don't know how formal or informal those are. Probably mostly informal, but you could probably do it in a very formal way if you wanted to. Another way that people are doing it are home equity loans, refinancing the existing house if there's equity in it. And then there are some construction loan options out there. And there's some drawbacks to them, namely high interest loans, and it requires getting the value of the property, future value of the property appraised in order to justify the loan that they're giving to you. So it's tricky to do it, but this is a more conventional pathway to getting a loan for doing an ADU. The only banks that I've heard of that this has been alluded to in an article that was posted somewhere, probably the Tribune like a year back, are Adventist Credit Union, which we mentioned before, Washington Federal, and Unitas. Notice there's no national banks on here. These are all local banks, and that's probably because they understand the local market and they understand what ADUs are. There's also 203K loans, which are FHA-backed loans for updating homes upon purchase, which is that option that I showed you before for that guy's house that he financed, for the ADU that he financed. And then there's like less formal arrangements where you can basically, you can either build it yourself, because the rule of thumb is that if it's going to cost $100 to $200 a square foot, you're going to be spending about half for material and half for labor, give or take. That's going to vary somewhat. So $50,000 for the materials, $50,000 for the labor. So obviously, if you can do all the work yourself, which I can't do because I work full time and maybe you guys do too, then you can't do all the work yourself. But if you are unemployed and you have $50,000, you might be able to build a $100,000 ADU with only $50,000. Or you can be creative about it and say, okay, I got this unemployed friend who's kind of skilled, wants to build a small home, and he will live for rent-free in my ADU after he's built it for X number of years to justify the cost the labor costs of having built that ADU. So you might only have to pay for the materials and subcontractors that you need up front.
There are building codes, they do need to be licensed and bonded, like, they need to be more than handy to build an ADU.
Yeah, I mean, homeowners are allowed to do most of the construction on their property, with the exception of you need a licensed plumber and a licensed electrician. Yeah, that's why I said you only pay for materials and subcontractors. So,
Cole,
yeah.
what if somebody wanted to build a new home with an attached dwelling at the time that they build the new home? Is there financing for that, passive in?
I don't have the answer to that, but I'm sure that you could finagle it just through a new construction loan somehow.
Finagle.
Yeah.
He can answer that question, yeah.
Cool, just to interrupt here.
Yeah.
Do you have a lot longer? You're at 25 minutes.
Okay, 2 more minutes, maybe?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, maybe Dakota can, or one of the other guys can answer that question better than I can. So ADU financing options are not great. They're booming, quote unquote, in Portland, but the financing is not good right now. Nonetheless, people are figuring out ways to finance them. This is the slide from Jordan's presentation earlier. They are essentially doubling over the last 3 years, which is awesome. 256 permits were taken out to build ADUs in the last, since the waiver was announced. That's equal to 1/6 of all single-family housing permits issued since then. So people are figuring out ways to do it, and hopefully the other guys can give you some other ideas that are from a more professional perspective on financing these things and appraising these things. Anyway, so that's my contact info, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, if anybody has a question particularly for Cole, let's do it right now. Okay.
How big is your lot?
It's a standard R5, 5,000 square foot lot. And I had a 1,700 square foot home and I built an 800 square foot ADU.
In the back there?
Can you talk about the waiver and
Oh yeah.
when it expires and?
Yeah, sure. That's sorry. I should have. That's a really important point, obviously, for everybody in this room. So the waiver is in effect from now till June 30th, 2013, which is in like 7 months, and that means you have to have your fully submitted permit package submitted by June 30th, 2013, and then you have 1 year to complete your construction and get your final certificate of occupancy. Now, there's a chance that that waiver may be extended, but I wouldn't count on it. If it may be extended. We hope it is extended, but if you're interested in building an ADU, definitely get in on this now.
What does the waiver cover?
The waiver covers a $7,000 to $12,000 system development charge that all new construction incurs in Portland. That's for park, transportation, and water fees that are a one-time fee that goes to the city of Portland for new infrastructure that's added, or new structures
So that's
added.
an FDC waiver then, is it pretty much?
Yeah.
Not all permits.
Right, and so you're still gonna have to pay a permit fee, which is gonna cost somewhere between $25,000 to $5,000 probably for a new construction ADU.
So what about converting an existing garage?
Same things, same fees, same SDC charges.
How about just one more, because we need to move on?
I just wanted to say that we only paid $1,600 in permit fees.
Oh, great.
That was a statement, not a question. This guy with the question, great.
Yeah, I have a question. Just the one thing that seems kind of odd about your numbers, I don't know how old your existing mortgage is, but to have a $1,700 mortgage and rent out a house for $3,000 seems like you're minting money regardless of whether it's an ADU or not.
Yeah.
And that seems like that's not a normal situation.
Maybe it's not normal.
It's because you have a very old mortgage, or?
No, I just am crafty.
Oh.
It's a nice house. I got a good deal on it. I refinanced at a really low rate, 3.875, I think. And the way that I rent it out, it works out to be actually making more than that most months. But yeah.
And there'll be more time, if we do this right, at the end for questions for anybody. In the meantime, thank you, Cole. In your presentation, Cole, I think there's a good segue to the next two speakers. Cole talked about, with the grandmother anecdote, the increase in equity, he called it, on the property based on the construction of this thing. Also, he talked about the Advantage program where you could borrow a certain amount, a certain percentage of the post-construction appraised value. So in both cases, we're thinking that construction will lead to an increase in appraised value. Appraised values are central to financing. But the experience that Taylor and I have is that appraised values on properties with ADUs can be a little wacky. Let's hear from the person in the mortgage industry and the appraiser. Dakota Gale.
Hello. So I tried to bail today because I do not feel well, but they talked me into it. So I'm gonna apologize if you can't hear me. And I've seen Cole's presentation on the financing stuff before, and so I'm kind of intending to just fill in where he didn't quite cover it, maybe because he's not in the industry. So please throw questions at me. I don't have a presentation prepared. I'm just going to talk about kind of the big roadblocks out there and probably a pretty high level, just what's going on, why can't we get financing for these things in a really easy way. A little bit about my background. My name is Dakota Gale, and I run a company called Free Mortgage Northwest. It's just a mortgage company in town. My background is actually mechanical engineering, so I started out doing energy models, solar work in California. I did some green building design up here, and along with the mortgage work that I've done some work for the Energy Trust of Oregon, helping develop some green finance programs, and I'll speak at conferences and kind of stay involved outside of just your purchase and refinance loans. So the biggest roadblock to financing ADUs is definitely that you don't have a huge market for it. And when you are looking at loans, when you go to the national level, to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac or some of the large banks, they want to see huge volume, like billions of dollars being financed in something before they'll create a specific program for it. And so that's why these local niche lenders are really good, like Advantage and some of the other ones, because they're holding these loans rather than originating a loan and then selling it on the national market. They're retaining that loan, and so they can do whatever they want as long as the risk profile meets whatever their underwriters deem acceptable. And so that's why the renovation loan is a great program. Washington Federal, which Cole mentioned, is good because they also retain their loans. So basically they're saying, we recognize that it's not quite fitting into a duplex, it's not a single family with a, what is it? We don't know, we don't care. We see this rental income, we're fine with it. Especially on the refinance side, this can be easier. As far as financing it, there just aren't that many construction loans out there right now. The market really contracted in about 2008, and there used to be 2,000 mortgage products, now there's about 25. So when you think about that, it's like vanilla 5-year ARMs, 30-year fixed, 15-year loans, 10-year. There aren't these crazy pick-a-payment things or any of that. So just that's kind of anecdotal too. There aren't that many loan programs out there available for financing ADUs. So right now I'm working on an ADU, and this is a good anecdote I think, where it's somebody who owns it as an investment property. They don't live in either the ADU or the house. And they built the ADU and they're trying to refinance it. And the work that Martin and Taylor have done, they've looked at this as a way to value these properties as duplexes, and that works great, but it's this catch-22 where the bank will look at it and say, it's not really a duplex, and it depends on their appetite for that loan at that time, and then just which bank is looking at it. And so sometimes you have to value them as a single-family residence with a detached ADU, and sometimes you have to do it as a duplex, but you don't know until you get the appraisal back. And so this particular example, it seemed better to do it, and the appraiser said this up front, to do it as a single family with a detached unit, and the appraisal comes back and it's totally miserable. And the homeowner's like, you said you could do this and this and this, why didn't you do that? So the way the communication stream worked on this is I, as the broker, can order not directly through the appraiser. I used to be able to call Taylor and say, hey, can you go out and appraise this property? You know how to do this particular type. I'd love for you to go do it. And not calling Taylor and saying, hey, we need $650,000 for the value, but I just want somebody who knows how to look at an income-based approach on something where they've done a research study on it, rather than somebody come out there, spend 10 minutes, and then throw some really low value at it and not spend the time. So the way it works now is there's an appraisal management company that I go to the bank, and then the bank orders from the appraisal management company who contracts to an appraiser. So it's this chain of communication that's just like playing telephone. It gets the appraiser like, yeah, just go out there, we don't really care. And it's just really painful sometimes. So the thing you can do, and this is a misconception in the market, is that realtors can't talk to the appraiser, the homeowner can't talk to the appraiser, nobody can talk to the appraiser, and that's not true at all. I can't talk to the appraiser as the lender. So the thing to remember if you're building, refinancing, any of this, is that you as the homeowner or the architect can throw as much information at the appraiser as you want to help get the value where you want it based on real data, because with the appraisal management company in the middle of all this, there just isn't that much money going to the appraiser. There's a middleman taking a cut of that appraiser's revenue, and there's extra paperwork, and Taylor can echo this, there's a lot more work that goes into an appraisal that isn't even related to valuing the property. And so you're more rushed, you don't have time to do the research maybe that you would have. And so communication is key on these. You have to be able to talk to the appraiser and tell them everything about it, present them with comparable sales, even on a purchase, show them what other properties have sold for, and that can help.
So are you saying that you have to do the appraiser's work for them?
No, it's not necessarily that, but
Provide them with comparable sales?
it can help to present those. And would you agree with that?
Sure.
That you're still you're gonna look and say, no, that's not a good comparable sale for the reasons, this reason, that reason. You don't just take whatever is presented to you, but because there's certain adjustment factors you can do, plus or minus 10% for net and gross value, things like that, that Fannie Mae and the big banks dictate. But you can say something that, maybe this, you didn't consider this because of this, and maybe it wasn't on Portland maps correctly, it wasn't on RMLS, and it's just one person's opinion of the value. So if you can go in and present extra data on it, that can really help.
Were you able to get the paper?
The paper.
I mean, were you able to write that refi?
So this one, the value initially came in at 300, and the house is probably worth 299 or something, maybe 280. So they're giving very passing value to it. They didn't develop the income-based approach at all on it. And when you look at appraisal, there's the two major ones that are used are the sales comparable and the income, and then sometimes the replacement value, but not really the cost. You're not going to look at that very often. So on this one, then he went back, and I talked to the AMC, said, this isn't what we're looking for. There's one comparable sale. Why did he want to appraise it like this? And it just came back at $365. So an almost $70,000 increase in value that then makes it possible to do this. And it's going to save this guy $700 a month to refinance.
And where were you actually able to shop that? And in other words, was there a local financing agent that?
It didn't even have to be local in this case,
Okay.
which is better because a lot of the time you're going to get better.
Okay, but you were
Better
actually
deal.
you were actually able to make that
Yeah.
refi happen.
Yeah.
Okay.
Any question?
It used to be a joke that MAI stood for Made As Instructed, and for appraisers. And you just mentioned that now you just sort of throw the request out there, and it goes into the pool, and you get sent to an appraiser. Is there any way to control or to influence who you get as an appraiser? I just have gone through that personally on my property, and the first two appraisers that called to make appointments with me, both bailed. Both, explained that they didn't really know anything about this kind of property.
Which is great.
And so now I've got, finally, the third person. It certainly would have been a lot easier for me to be able to facilitate that in the first place.
Sure. Yeah, and you as the client are at the top of the food chain. You have to talk to your lender and tell them, this is what I need, and then they have to talk to the appraisal management company, excuse me, who then contracts with the appraiser. And if you feel that whoever is doing this appraisal isn't competent for some reason, then you can push back and say, this person shouldn't be out here. That's great that those first two said, we don't know what to do, because a lot of times that's not the case.
Right, but is there any way, rather than just continuing to throw rejections at them to actually say,
Yeah.
I know this dude, I mean, especially as a developer or a builder, after you develop an understanding of which people know what they're talking about, can you influence who you get
Yeah.
as an appraiser?
So what I've done is I work with a local appraisal management company called First Choice, and I can call them and talk to them directly, rather than RELS is a big one that Wells Fargo contracts to, or LandSafe. There's all these huge ones that like Bank of America and Wells Fargo use, and those will not even talk to you. They will just farm it out to anybody, and usually it's the cheapest person out there. It'll be somebody from 50 miles away coming in from Battleground to appraise a property in Hawthorne. They don't really know necessarily what's going on. But
I can speak to that a little too if you want to bring that up again.
yeah, but so my process was I added these local appraisers, such as Taylor, such as other people who have been through trainings on appraising green properties that have energy efficient upgrades, because a lot of times in ADU you'll have that, and you can translate that into value as well. And so I can request from that roster, I can't say I want Taylor to go out there and do it, but I can say, we have 6 people that I've added to your roster, I want one of them to go. I just want somebody who knows what they're talking about. So yeah, it's doable, but you need somebody local that's doing it, and that's the issue with the big retail banks. Is there another question?
Go ahead.
Can we revisit a new construction if you want to build a new construction?
Yeah, that's what I was
and
about-
add the attached dwelling unit?
Yeah, so you'll see a lot of these now where it's a main house built with some kind of almost, it's like a 3/4 basement where like the driveway down is now the entrance to the ADU. And so it's definitely doable. A lot of the builders that are doing this are financing it with private money. And they'll get some kind of short-term construction loan, like it's called a hard money loan, where you pay a really high percentage rate, like 13% to get a loan, or 6% at the kind of low end for something to finance this. And then when you sell it, you pay off your construction loan, take your profit as the builder. And so you'll see that. For a homeowner doing it, Umpqua Bank has a pretty good construction loan program for single-family owner-occupied only. They don't do what are called spec loans, where you go and say, we have a lot that we're going to buy and we're going to build a house and hope somebody buys it. They'll do it for somebody who says, we want that lot, we want to live in that house. And then you could definitely do something like that.
And that applies even if there's going to be a rentable portion.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, Dakota, I'd say probably the most common scenario that I hear about is somebody who is a single-family homeowner, they want to develop a new ADU. Just what would your first 1 or 2 options be for them?
Yeah.
Or is there nothing?
So the advanced program is great, and you can do a lot of things with the advanced program. You can go in and take a home where I just had somebody who ran out of money on credit cards, couldn't finance finishing out a home that they live in. And so they went to Advantis, and Advantis helped them pay off all their credit cards with basically a refinance construction loan to finish the house. But because it's a local bank, you can talk to Kate or Jerry at Advantis and say, I want to do this, and they'll say, okay, what's the return going to be? What do you plan on renting it for? And you can look at other data and then say, well, this is 0.2% of our total exposure to the real estate market. We can go out on a limb a little bit for this property. So that's one good option. The cash out refinance, people still do that. There's a lot of people that, believe it or not, still have equity in their homes. And so you can do a cash out refinance to get some of that money back. What I see a lot is that people will get the things that Cole referenced, the private loan from parents or from a 401k, and then you can refinance it after the fact and take your money out to refill your 401k, something like that, because you can borrow $50K from your 401k. Or you can pay back.
Can you define a cash out refinance?
Yeah, so a cash out refinance is simply, let's say you owe $150,000 on your primary mortgage and your house is worth $400,000, you could take $100,000 out of the property in order to build this, and then your new loan amount would just be one loan, would be $250,000. And then your house would theoretically appraise for more, which I definitely see that it appraises for more with an ADU. And it's becoming much easier to actually get a higher value for these. There's definitely anomalies where the property's somewhere where you can't find comps within a mile. But if it's pretty close in, you're going to be able to find comparable sales typically.
With that, I fear that we should, to have time left at the end for questions for everybody, we should move on to Taylor.
I'm not sitting down.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Ted. And good to see you, Zach. Appropriate email thread from this morning. We were just talking about sort of some of the things, a particular property that I think it was, all I saw was it was a new ADU in a refi was valued by the appraiser at 20 grand.
It's pretty horrifying.
Yeah, so my own case, I have an ADU, detached ADU, and we had it appraised for a refi. It was built cash. We had it appraised for a refi about 18 months ago. The first appraisal as a single family home with a guest house was $350. But as a duplex, it was worth $450. So these kinds of stories are common. Thanks very much. These kinds of stories are common. I think Martin had a similar experience with his ADU, this one this morning, the one Dakota was just talking about. The same thing. And I'm going to try to explain why that happens, or why that can happen. First is describing how appraisals work. What is it? It's really important to know that an appraisal is an opinion of value. And opinions vary. So you can send the same appraiser out to appraise, or you can send 5 different appraisers out to appraise the same property and end up with a range of differing opinions of value. But the whole appraisal process is supposed to limit the variation in the final opinions. The problem, or one of the reasons you end up with these huge ranges, is because properties with ADUs are not typical. They're atypical. And if the data on which appraisers are relying to reach a reasonable opinion of value vary widely, the results are going to vary. Okay, that's the primary reason. Now, besides being an opinion, the 3 typical ways appraisers arrive at these opinions are the sales comparison approach to value, which you're all familiar with when Dakota was mentioning comparables or comps or things. That's the most common. The cost approach is another, and income approach is the third. So this is not an appraisal class, but I just want to get you sort of on board with what my world is and how it applies to ADUs. So you can talk more reasonably and knowledgeably with people when you're trying to get financing on these places. So the sales comparison approach is the most common in residential appraising. Okay, you mentioned MAIs. Those are typically, it's a designation for a commercial or a general appraiser. SRA would be the designation from the same group for residential appraisers. Residential appraisers, only up to 4 units. That's it, that's all I appraise. So duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes are the only income producing properties I have any experience with. Having done this in Portland for about 22 years now, I can say all of the work I do, probably only 5% of it is 2, 3, or 4 unit properties. Okay, and I think that's pretty common. So even a typical duplex, triplex, or fourplex is a very small part of the work I do anyway. So now you're asking me to understand a unique sort of property that's going to take the typical appraiser time to learn about. Their fee is typically not going to increase. And should they really even spend the extra time when it's such a small part of their practice anyway? So that's just one of the problems you might run into. Other than that, when you see the property of the ADU like Kohl's, what's comparable to it? I'm going around trying to use these established appraisal methods, and there's nothing like it around. Now, there are more ADUs around now than there used to be, but it's not just the number of ADUs that are, properties with ADUs that are out there. They have to have sold recently for me to have any idea that they're out there, or be able to peg a market-related value to it. Okay, so very small part of the market, and just think how many have sold in the last 90 days that I can actually use in the appraisal in a way that an underwriter will accept. Okay, so there are basic principles for appraisal, but all the callbacks I get from lenders that I've had over the last 20 years are not related to the appraisal process, but related to lender guidelines for what is acceptable. Okay, I can do an appraisal and feel confident in it, but that doesn't mean the lender will still want to lend on it. Okay? So finding comparables and determining what actually is comparable to a property with an ADU is a problem. Okay? Now the cost approach to value is also, used by appraisers. Can anyone in here tell me what the relationship of cost to value is? I'm moving around too much?
No, whatever.
What's the relationship of cost to value? Yes?
Replacement cost?
Okay, replacement cost. There's reproduction cost and replacement cost that appraisers use. Here's the answer. Cost can be less than value, the same as value, or more than value. This is very important to builders out here. You know it intuitively. Just because you put 20 grand into your house doesn't mean your house is worth 20 grand more tomorrow. Okay, so, and what happens if I put 200 grand into a property, or I build a property for 200 grand and someone gives me 100 for it tomorrow? Is it worth 200 or is it worth 100? It's probably closer to 100 because that's what somebody just paid me for it. The difference between the 200 I put into it and the 100 that someone's paying me is called obsolescence. That's called overbuilding. Okay, and it doesn't occur only in clean properties or high performance properties. It occurs in custom building all the time. It's just a principle. So know that the cost approach to value I will develop for the property. But the cost approach to value might not be what the market value for the property is. But I will develop it anyway. And I think, and this is basically what these guys were referring to a little bit earlier. And what sources am I going to use as an appraiser to adequately cost the value or the construction cost of the ADU? Where am I going to get that? Is it going to be a traditional source that appraisers use? Probably not, because there aren't a lot of sources out there for 400 to 900 square foot homes. They're atypical. And this goes to what Dakota was just mentioning. If you're building one and an appraiser's coming out there and you have hard costs, because hard costs are like you were speaking to, or what appraisers are really going to use, the soft cost, the financing cost, the time cost of money, all those things. I'm dealing with hard costs. If you have the costs for that, is that going to influence my opinion of the property? It will influence it. It doesn't mean I'm going to say you put 100 into it, I think it's worth 100 at the end, but the cost there is a relationship of cost to value. But that's not the end all for it, but yes, it will influence it. Because if I don't know anything about ADUs and I go in and look at the construction, I say, well, this looks like average quality $75 a square foot construction. But if it actually cost $105 to do it, it will cause me to reconsider my approach to the property. Okay, so I always say the more information you can give the appraiser, the better. Whether they listen to you or not, or they seem like they're listening to you or not, the more information, the better. Their job, essentially, is analyzing as much data related to the market as possible. Okay? Finally, though, is the income approach to value. It's rarely used in residential appraising. Okay, remember, I just said about 5% of the jobs I've done over the last 20 plus years have been income producing properties. So I don't use it very often. And hang on just a second. And as applies to ADUs, if I don't know a lot about ADUs locally, I'm not even going to consider using the income approach to value. If I never seen them, I don't know what the legal uses are for the property. If the owner doesn't know and I'm not being told by the lender or the broker, this is the type of property and the things I need to consider doing it, it might be completely over my head. And in your case, where two appraisers said, I don't know anything about it and I'm not going to appraise it, that's actually a good sign. That means they were getting the messages through that pipeline that this is a unique kind of property. If it's a unique kind of property, you need to be willing to pay the appraiser more. You're willing to pay the builder more. The broker's going to make the same amount of commission on the property. The appraiser is going to do extra work. If you're going to require them to do extra work, you got to be willing to pay for it. Okay, a single family appraisal is like $400, $450. locally. A duplex is in the $700 range. It's like an extra $200 to $300 for you to get a much more accurate valuation. So I just encourage you to just pay the fee, because that's actually more commensurate with the additional work that the appraisal will take. Okay, what is the whole theory of the income approach is if it can rent for more, shouldn't it be worth more? Yeah, the nicer apartments rent for more than chromier apartments. Yes. The whole idea is I have two theoretical income streams for this property. In Portland, it's critical. You can rent both units. In most markets, I think there was a gal here from Seattle, in the markets we looked at in Santa Cruz, in Boston, in other places you can only rent one unit. So the income approach isn't going to help you as much. You only have one rentable unit, but Portland is unique. You can rent both. But, as Martin pointed out in the beginning, they're in single-family zones. So remember, as an appraiser who doesn't have a lot of experience with these, the assumption off the bat is that it is an illegal use, right? And therefore, if I even mention it in the appraisal, or if the lender thinks if they mention it that you won't get a loan, period, okay? So I can rent both units, so I have two income streams going into the future. The whole purpose of this approach is capitalizing both those at a value today, okay? And that the rental income from a property, like I just said, has a relationship to its market value, all right? And if I have two income streams for a property, it's typically worth more than if there's only one. So what we found in looking at a bunch of properties with ADUs that have sold is that when they were valued using standard appraisal techniques for the income approach was typically, it was around 7 to 9% higher on average. But then we looked at these properties and said, well, if they're actually selling for 7 to 9% lower than what the income is showing for these properties, where's the disconnect? Why aren't they closer? And what do you think? Why does it seem to be worth a little bit more from the income approach than what somebody actually forked out for that property? Any guesses?
It's not a typical.
It's not a typical
thing. I mean, it's as a consumer, you have to be willing to dive in there, and you may not.
You do.
Be ready.
And it's the people representing those properties that sold on the open market, the buyers, the sellers, the brokers, everybody is misinformed about the legal uses for ADUs locally. But it's changing, and you can see that from the number of these units being built, the number of them that are getting financing, all the press around them. I've seen a huge change just in the last year on these. Now, it leads to requiring several things doing the income approach. Everybody needs to understand the legal uses of the ADU, and it has to be a legal ADU. 2 weeks ago, I looked at a property. Beautiful little cottage with fully renovated and a matching renovated detached garage that had been changed into an apartment. When I looked at permits for the place, no permits on anything. So I can't, I could appraise